Hey, welcome back to our first lecture in a week. Woo. And one of our last as well. We only have, I believe, 6 more of these counting today, and then we are completely done. So, we've got some good news in terms of getting ports open to the public internet that we can actually do something with. That might happen before the end of the semester. With 2 weeks to go, woo! We might actually get some open ports. So you'll be able to give hosting your applications on the open internet at least a brief shot. If that does happen, I'm going to prioritize that over doing the other stuff that we had planned to do this semester, because obviously that's a lot more interesting. So we'll see. If it does happen, you should get an email from Amazon Workspaces on instructions on how to set up your account. So go ahead and do that. It doesn't take very long, and that is different from your regular retail Amazon account. As we discussed earlier on how to make money on the internet, the bulk of Amazon's business and the bulk of Amazon's profit comes not from its retail branch, but from its web hosting, which is what we might be taking advantage of. Its web hosting includes hosting websites, online services, machine learning, and remote desktops, and all kinds of other things. So Amazon Web Services is a different business. You can even consider it almost a different company from Amazon Retail. So you will have to make a separate account. And the web client is probably fine for everything we do, as long as you remember not to hit the back button, which is probably the most annoying part of the web client. Alright, I thought we would get into it a little bit easily. So I'm going to start with finishing the How to Make Money on the Internet series, and then we're going to learn about the last couple of application layer protocols that we're going to learn about this semester. The homework for the RSA encryption. A lot of people asked for extensions, so we're going to be probably getting the next and final assignment on Wednesday instead of today, just to give people a chance to wrap that up. And the final homework assignment will probably be due the following Friday or so before finals week. Final will probably be take home at this point. Not sure. And then don't forget that we also have an exam on a Friday, which will probably involve some of that application layer stuff, but it'll otherwise be the same format that you've seen so far. Okay. Any questions on any of that before we move on? Someone asked, what is the final exam going to be like? It'll probably be like all the other exams that you've had so far, except it will probably have a longer take-home component instead of being timed. Okay. So I wanted to go back to arbitrage for a minute. We were just past this when we left off. I wanted to go back to arbitrage because it's become a huge issue this holiday season. Anybody know why arbitrage is a huge issue this holiday season? It often is. There are definitely many times where arbitrage has become a problem. Going back to the Tickle Me Elmo age and way before, arbitrage has always been an issue during the holidays. But arbitrage from a cybersec or from a digital perspective has been a big problem in this year, especially with the increased popularity of shopping online versus shopping in store. What's been the problem with arbitrage in this holiday season? Why can't I get an Xbox? Not that I'm trying to buy an Xbox. Not that there's anything wrong with the Xbox, but why can't you get one unless you're willing to go on eBay and pay $800-900+ for one? Why can't you get a NVIDIA 3000 series card or the AMD 7000 series cards? Why can't we get all kinds of lovely things this holiday season? Well, it's because of cybersecurity arbitrage. Essentially, there are currently a large number of bots that compete for any time a product drops with the interest of reselling it. Yes, somebody responded in time. Robots buy it out first, that's right. It's become a really big problem. Much bigger than it ever was before, and there is no simple solution for it at this point. Basically, anytime a new product comes out, we almost expect for it to be gobbled up by retail bots before basically anybody in the general public is able to get it. Now, if you are very interested in the purchase of a product, there are now large forums, discords, other places you can go to get those bots yourself, just so you can, as a legitimate consumer, buy the product that you're trying to buy. Otherwise, within minutes of a popular product dropping, bots will buy out all of it and then relist them on resale sites like Amazon and eBay at a significant upcharge, getting basically high ticket items below MSRP has become a thing of the past. So this is unfortunate. How do we stop retail bots? There are a couple of great solutions that I've seen. The best solution I've seen has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with being an epic troll. When Games Workshop released a popular box product that was at a significant discount, a bundle of what they sell basically, bots scooped it up within minutes and listed the units on eBay for double the price. They proceeded to say, well, we're just going to take back orders and we're going to basically make this made to order, and we are not going to offer refunds for anybody who bought more than one of these things. So all of those bot sellers got stuck buying a bunch of these things for basically no ability to turn around a profit because their margin became non-existent. Now, why would anybody buy it for double the price on eBay when you can just buy it from the merchant again? So basically, release it and then release it again, but with a larger inventory, so thus undercutting all of the scalpers with your own inventory. That's probably the coolest approach that I've seen. But otherwise, there has been a pretty big surge of different websites attempting to counteract bot purchasing by making it lottery based or something of that nature, making it a line drawing, putting things on back order. These are different systems that have been implemented to try to get the scalpers less power. Let's see, somebody posted Adorama is getting framed on Twitter right now because the PS5 stock was sold out in 2 minutes today. Yeah, that seems pretty par for the course. I think we'll probably see this happen on every big ticket item in the holiday season, probably for years to come at this point until somebody figures it out. The only solution is probably to go out and go to your brick or mortar and get some units, but that is becoming more and more difficult as the percentage of online sales is going up. It's actually hard to get units at brick and mortars because they just have less of them. So even if you're willing to go out, it's not always the case that it's going to be possible. And of course, when you have arbitrage, you have search engine optimization. All of those scalped PS5s are going to go somewhere. Where are they going to go? Well, they are going to go somewhere on the internet, right? They're going to go either on eBay or Amazon, and that means that you're going to have to try to optimize your listing on those websites. And you can also probably find scalped units on other smaller third-party websites. Those are also vying for the top spot on the search engine in order to sell you your scalped PS5 or Xbox or what have you. The irony, by the way, of those two products getting scalped and resold at such a high premium is that products like that are often sold at a loss to the consumer to make them more appealing. The hardware in them at launch typically costs more than they make off a unit, and the expectation that it'll get cheaper as the console matures, and that you will spend a lot of money on games which you are no longer able to resell because physical copy is essentially dead. Alright, we talked about knockoffs and counterfeits. Not as much of a problem with these fancy new products, but every time for example, a new generation of graphics card comes out and the aforementioned buyout and scalping happens, there is also a significant amount of counterfeiting that occurs with the knockoffs and these scalped units actually being older models that were somehow duped into looking like newer models. So this is another problem that you have to watch out for that's paired with the problem of getting a scalped unit. You might get a scalped unit that's also not even real. That would be incredibly annoying, especially since it might take you a while to figure it out. And if this is something that you're passionate about and you're looking to get a job in it, all kinds of different companies are looking to prevent this practice. Amazon, to their credit, now spending over $500 million a year preventing counterfeits, knockoffs, frauds, to some extent scalping and other things, developing lots of algorithms to spot fake reviews, review cheating. There are already websites out there like FakeSpot that let you look at reviews for a product to see how organic they appear. Your mileage may vary on those applications, but I have always found that things that I know are fake do typically get F ratings on those kinds of websites, so they do seem to work for some things. However, I don't know any product that is for sure not knockoffed or counterfeited or fake reviewed, so I can't test it the other way. Alright. And then you've got your basic fraud online we talked about. A big problem in retail sales on the internet is that chargebacks favor the buyer. You can always pretend that you didn't get something, and that's a huge problem in online sales. It means that the buyer has to have reputation to an extent as well as the seller, which is a problem because you want people to be able to enter your platform and just buy things. This was a big problem on eBay, that it was difficult to get started even as a buyer because many sellers would not sell big ticket items to people who did not have a lot of reputation under the fear that they would get chargebacked or frauded out of their purchase. And then, of course, the seller can be a bad actor too. This is usually less of a problem because seller reputation is a lot harder to launder and broker, and typically buyers will gravitate towards sellers that have thousands of reviews. So yes, you can sell that kind of account and milk it for fraud to an extent, but you can't do that for very long because buyers are going to figure it out pretty quick. So the commoditization of reputation is something that we're going to see as a recurring theme here, that reputation, once it becomes a commodity and trust becomes a commodity, reputation gets bought and sold, and that's where we see a lot of this dark pattern. Remember when we talked about social media advertising earlier? The buying and selling and farming of social media accounts also has become a huge industry. Getting things to the top of the Reddit front page is a matter of having a bunch of high reputation accounts that can post organic looking content, get you to the front there, and thusly have your product listed. Alright, so what about the black market sales, the actual illegal sales on the internet themselves? First of all, a lot of what is illegal to sell on the internet, we like to think of things like drugs and prostitution and hitmen, but there's a pretty big market for things that are illegal, but probably wouldn't fall outside of what most people call moral. And for example, I'm going to quote, let's go with cigarettes. So a fairly large portion of all cigarettes purchased are counterfeits, or I guess smuggled would be the correct term. A fairly large portion of all cigarettes that are purchased are smuggled because cigarettes have a very substantial tax on them, and of course people have an incentive to acquire their cigarettes as cheaply as possible. So a lot of people buy their cigarettes in gray market transactions where they don't pay the incredibly high tax. If you don't pay a tax on a pack of cigarettes, you can get it for half, maybe even a third of the price, which of course, if you're a smoker, is thousands of dollars a year. Alcohol is another one of these things. Try buying a bottle of alcohol online in the beautiful state of Ohio. Go ahead, give it a shot. If you're 21, of course, I recommend go find a nice bottle, something rare, and go see where you can buy it in the state of Ohio, because it's not easy. Many states, Ohio included, have state liquor agencies that give basically a monopoly on the sale of liquor to the state, and there is no online shopping for liquor legally. So to an extent, there was a lot of illegal sale of liquor online for some time in Ohio, but it's recently been cracked down on, and it is very difficult to purchase any kind of rare liquor online. So if you're looking for, let's say you're a collector and you want to 100-year-old bottle of wine or something, good luck. You're never going to find it. You're going to have to go to another state to buy it. All right. There's also the tax advantage of buying online prior to the implementation of sales tax being collected on the internet. It used to be that you did not get sales taxed on many purchases on the internet. You were just supposed to report those on your taxes and pay them at the end of the year. And of course, not too many people ended up doing that. So there was a lot of tax fraud in that extent. So those aren't necessarily illegal goods, but they are gray market sales transactions online that people do in order to pay a lesser amount. And of course, the cybersecurity element of that is that when you sell to somebody now, you have to figure out what jurisdiction they live in so that you can tax them properly. We currently generally use shipping address, but you can also use things like IP geolocation to figure out where somebody is. Of course, that's not perfect, as we know. IPs are not exactly correlated with geographic locations, and using people's shipping address isn't exactly perfect either, because that might not be the jurisdiction where the tax applies. And in many countries, other goods are illegal as well. Obviously, the legality of different pharmaceutical substances varies from place to place, not just narcotics and things like that, but also things like antibiotics used to be available for public purchase without a prescription in places like Mexico. And most of the world cracked down on that sort of thing, but for some time you could simply buy those on the internet. And then there's, of course, different tiers of applications for the same substances. So going back to antibiotics, for example, you can't buy them for human consumption, but you can buy them for animal consumption without a prescription in some instances. So you have this strange two-tiered system where a website can pretend that they're selling antibiotics that are intended for animals when most of their purchasers are actually buying them for human consumption. So you can have this sort of gray market as well. But let's talk about purely illegal goods. Let's talk about things that we know are illegal. So things that are like narcotics and prostitution and hitmen and all these kinds of things. Let's talk about those first. So, anonymous networks like the Onion Router and other platforms that allow people to be anonymous as they browse the internet have given access to regular people to the black market. Another reason that this took off so well in the 2000s is because generally there's not a ton of packet inspection in the United States for physical parcels. This has largely become less true. There's now much more inspection, especially for parcels that are shipped from abroad. But there's not too much inspection, so you can basically ship whatever you want as long as you pack it tightly enough, which is good. Your mail should be private, and we should apply that logic again to our networks. Anything that's inside of a box should probably stay in a box, and the network that is distributing it should be treated as simply passing it along without being able to observe it, even though we can't trust the service that's moving our data packets along. But of course, again with the metaphor, the government obviously has a strong incentive for figuring out what's in our data packets, just like they have an incentive for figuring out what's in our physical packets to make sure that basically you're not shipping drugs across the internet and across the United States. Now, if you are an e-retailer and you're selling illegal goods, so this would be websites like the Silk Road, it's actually not a very profitable market. It's usually something that the e-retailer does more of as a moral or whatever kind of gesture. It's generally not something where you make a ton of money. And I'd say not a ton of money. I mean, you can still make millions of dollars if you become extremely successful, as the Silk Road did. But there are a lot of problems with being an illegal retailer. First of all the people on your platform are criminals, and criminals are not very trustworthy people by and large. So that problem of people scamming one another, multiply that tenfold, and that's the kind of thing you have when you run a platform that is primarily selling illegal goods. And this applies to all the gray market examples we covered earlier, where you've got your smuggled cigarettes or your black market liquor or whatever it is that you're trying to sell. Those products are also things that have very little recourse. If the buyer decides they're going to screw over the seller wasn't even really supposed to sell it to you, so it becomes a very one-sided transaction in terms of the buyer's power to defraud the seller in that case. But at the same time, as the buyer, you weren't supposed to buy that either, so it becomes a a difficult thing overall. Which is why, a lot of the time, these illegal platforms will use cryptocurrency instead. The advantage to cryptocurrency from the seller's point of view is that there is no backseas, so there is no chargeback, which means that, again, the seller has the power to defraud the buyer. They could just not ship the product. And you have a reputation-based system, once again, where clients rely on reputation to see which seller is legitimate. But a reputation system isn't enough when you're dealing with a platform that you don't trust, and again, a bunch of criminals that you don't trust. So this system essentially demands some kind of escrow system. So basically all of these illegal markets, places like the Silk Road, where people can buy and sell stuff that is clearly illegal, all end up forming some kind of trusted escrow system wherein the buyer will put up their money up front, the seller will put up their goods up front, a third party will hold both until the transaction is complete, basically. So the seller will show the third party that they shipped their goods, the buyer will put their money in the third party immediately, and then as soon as the third party confirms that the buyer got their stuff, they will distribute the funds accordingly. So this kind of escrow system basically ends up forming on all these kinds of illegal websites, and that kind of escrow system is difficult to maintain and not very profitable, and more importantly, a huge high-value hacking target. Because if you hack a place like the Silk Road, of course they can't go to the FBI, they can't go to their local authorities, they can't go to the police. So the money is yours in the clean if you manage to steal it from criminals. This is why criminals rob each other so much, because criminals know that other criminals have no legal recourse when they are robbed. If you rob somebody's legally obtained currency, generally speaking, they have some way to get it back, and they can go to the law and have you pursued. Whereas if you rob the Silk Road, they just have to take it because there's really nothing they can do about it. Obviously, they can't go to the authorities and complain. So Silk Road 2 lost $2.5 million worth of Bitcoin, which was their entire escrow fund, to a hack. And there are many other examples like this where illegal enterprises, mostly gambling websites and things like that, have been hacked and had their entire pool of money stolen. And there are also examples where illegal websites, particularly gambling and cryptocurrency exchanges, claim to have been hacked and really just ran off with all the money. Of course, you usually can't prove it, but that's another common scam, again, when you're dealing with criminals. Now, really illegal things, so things that the state has a huge incentive to crack down on, things like hitmen and stuff that we really don't want to see in society. Those things are usually honeypots by authorities to try to catch people who are dumb enough to hire a hitman. So any listing for a hitman on the internet is probably the FBI trying to catch people who are stupid enough to hire a hitman, which is obviously attempted murder and gets you put in jail for a very long time. Hiring a contract killer, very bad idea, so don't do that. And any other kind of things that are really illegal, things like human trafficking, those are pretty much always going to be a scam, or more likely, and probably for the best, they're going to be the authorities themselves trying to get you to admit, basically, that you have attempted to do something really, really illegal on the internet. Okay, so your other option, instead of selling physical things, is to sell digital things. So you could sell digital goods and services. Here we've got, unlike the platforms that charge a subscription for content, these are the platforms that charge a subscription for a service. So they're actually providing you some kind of software or some kind of platform on which you do things, differentiating it from places like media outlets and such like that that are just offering you content in exchange for your money. So this includes platforms like Netflix, Spotify, YouTube Premium, YouTube TV, Amazon AWS, which we already talked about, etc. Back in the day, software was just sold once, and you only got money for it once. It was sold shrink-wrapped as a one-time sale. Basically, you got the physical disc, and you got a product key, and you had the license to use that key a certain number of times. You used the disc to install your software, and everyone was happy. There was a very, very low incentive for anybody to do any kind of support or updating on the software after you had already bought the disc, obviously. So there was a reputation thing to take into account. So software did get updates, but it didn't get that many. And typically when there was a large version update, they'd come out with a new disk and a new key, and you had to buy it again. So that wasn't completely ideal for people that wanted to stay up to date on their important software. It had a pretty limited life cycle of software back then. So that's the negative side of that. The positive end, obviously, is in many cases it was a lot cheaper to buy the software once. And in many cases, you could buy the software once and continue to use it for decades. I know people using software that they legally purchased in before 2000, so probably like 98's the oldest software that I know that somebody has just a regular shrink-dried copy that they still use. So good for them. Probably like $200, and I guess if you average it out, something like $10 a year. Not bad. So today, generally speaking, we see software sold as a service instead. Software as a service, usually abbreviated SaaS, dominates software sales. We see things like Google Suite, Office 365, Unity. These are all sold by a monthly or annual subscription. Sometimes they're sold on a usage-based. Sometimes they have some other kind of pricing structure in mind. And they provide a service incentive, as in there's now an incentive to provide updates and support and all these kinds of things, but the cost has gone up, generally speaking, quite a bit. So, of course, whenever you have something where the cost goes up, you generate a lot of piracy. Software as a service prevents piracy to an extent because the service is only accessible if you get a legal copy and you manage to authenticate it with the digital rights management system. You can't pirate Google Drive for fairly obvious reasons, but you can still pirate many other platforms that think that they want to be SaaS because they really aren't. They are still just applications that are trying to get a subscription out of their software. So Microsoft Office, Windows itself, Unity, these are all still things where you just get a copy of the software. And even though you might not necessarily be able to get your updates and support with the pirated copy, at least it's going to work. And the problem with all of these pieces of software that makes them so piratable is that they really have to work offline or they frustrate everybody. It's possible to get your software to be unpiratable by forcing it to phone home every time it needs to connect, but as we saw with the recent Mac outage and with countless other examples across the decades, if your software has to connect to the internet in order to run, all you're going to do is infuriate people, and in fact you're going to drive pirates to work doubly hard to figure out how to crack your software. And actually bypass your connection to the internet anyway. So in many cases, even though this is probably the best way to prevent software piracy, in many cases it's still not going to work, which makes it kind of moot. You've got your subscription shares cutting into your revenue if you sell things digitally. So Netflix is the big example. How many people pay for their own Netflix account? Let's do a poll. How many people pay for their own Netflix account? Probably shockingly small, right? A lot of people share. Netflix has tried over the years to consider how they might crack down on subscription sharing in order to get more subscriptions. It's not entirely clear, though, that just because you share your subscription with others that you would buy your own subscription if you had stopped sharing it. And me, personally, I think I've only paid for like 3 months of Netflix ever, and otherwise I've just shared it with somebody the entire time. I think that's probably the case for most people. I don't know who these suckers are that still pay for their own Netflix, but it's not that many people out there. If Netflix ever cracks down on sharing, though, how many people are they going to use? Somebody said Adobe Creative Cloud is a money laundering scheme. Adobe Creative Cloud is one of those examples of a software as a service that was once something that you could buy. What a lot of people don't remember is that when you could buy it, it was super expensive. Adobe used to be, just Photoshop was like $700. So it was difficult to be a professional. And I say difficult in the sense that you had to pirate it essentially because very few people who want to do Photoshop have access to $700 to just blow, especially if you're young in the profession. So Adobe's business model and the business model of many other companies in the early 2000s was basically to let their service get pirated with the expectation that they would sell enterprise seats later. So Bill Gates has a famous quote, I don't remember it exactly, but when he was asked about how he feels that China has millions of computers being sold every year, and Microsoft isn't making a dollar out of them. This was back when China was an emerging market. And of course, they weren't paying for their Microsoft licenses. They were broadly pirating all of them. He basically said, well, let them steal it, and hopefully they get hooked and buy it in the future when they're not an emerging economy anymore. This was the Photoshop business model, too. It's also the business model for things like CAD and all those other softwares. They give them away for free by basically making them easy to pirate. Unity has famously said the same thing, that piracy built their platform by having basically people come in and get hooked on it and then stay and end up paying for it when they got into enterprise, and piracy wasn't really an option anymore. So to an extent, piracy becomes sort of a marketing platform for those kinds of applications. But when you offer something like Creative Cloud, which is more difficult to pirate, I guess, not particularly though. I'm sure a lot of people here, I already see people commenting that they got Adobe on Pirate Bay, so it's not like it's impossible, but I guess it's slightly harder, I mean, marginally, but it's cheaper. It's actually accessible to individual people to an extent. What is something like $15 a month or $20 a month for the lowest tier, and you get access to Photoshop, which again was once just $700 a disc, no updates. You just got the version that was out, and that's it. And if you wanted the next one, you had to go buy another $700 disc. So if you had upgraded from versions 1 through, they probably started selling Creative Cloud around 6 or something. Do the math, you spent like $4,000 on Adobe licenses. And that is in the United States. In other countries where Adobe thought they could make more money, they offered it for much, much more than $700. I think Australia is something like 2,000 USD to buy it. So somebody said you're a sucker for paying for Creative Cloud. I wouldn't say you're necessarily a sucker, but is it? Are you a sucker if you can steal something, but you choose to pay for it? I guess that depends on how you perceive that. All right, back to subscription sharing. You could probably do this on Creative Cloud too, but a lot of those services make it harder by making it so only one copy can run at a time. And then, of course, things like Google Suite, like Google Drive. Yeah, you could share it if you want, but then all of your data is being shared as well. So those are kind of things that typically don't get shared for that reason. Software as a service is often sold on this per-seat basis, and this is a great moneymaker for software as a service sales to enterprise. So, okay, even if a couple people pirate Photoshop here and there, I believe Photoshop is one of these things that's sold on a per-seat basis. So if you have a graphic design studio and you employ 50 people, you need to buy 50 licenses of Photoshop, technically. You need to buy one for each machine and one for each user, depending on how the license is worded. A lot of companies will try to circumvent this by buying not quite that many, and a lot of software as a service vendors will offer a unlimited license, usually much more expensive, something on the order of 10, maybe even 100 times more expensive than the per seat license, in order to get as many as you want, basically, for the organization. So Microsoft sometimes offers this on Windows to really big organizations. There's also things like bulk discounts and things like that. A lot of companies have been leaning towards making the private version of your application either free or very low cost, again, to get people hooked. So taking on that piracy business model as part of their actual business model. Now, the cybersec side of that, of course, is how do you know that a company is using your product in the way that the license describes? So how do you know that they're using the free tier as an individual rather than as an organization? How do you know that they're not just cheating you out of their money? There are lots of cool technologies to try to figure out if a user is actually using it as an individual or as an organization. You'll see some software just limit features. You'll see some software limit the amount that it can be used or how much bandwidth it can handle. And you'll see other software have some sort of legal statement. Unity, for example, has if you make less than $100,000 a year, you can use the free versions without paying any royalties. If you make more than $100,000 a year, you must buy Pro. So if they can prove that you made more than $100,000 a year, which isn't particularly difficult to do in court, and they can prove that you used Unity, then you've got to fork over for a Unity subscription. But preventing installation on multiple machines is another one of those hard problems. How do you prevent somebody from taking their Photoshop disk and moving it to a bunch of different machines? Creative Cloud solves that to an extent by making it so that only one person can be signed in at a time. And then there's extortion, one of the most rapidly growing markets in the world. Extortion is a huge part of the internet today. It's almost always illegal, but it's not always illegal. Look at some wonderful legal examples. And extortion basically comes down to give us money or X happens. Now, going back to advertising we talked about last time, a lot of advertising is kind of extortionate too. It's like, buy your own keywords or we're going to rank search results for your own search, your own keywords. So your Geico, buy Geico as an advertising keyword, or we're going to rank other crap above you when people search for Geico. That is, to an extent, extortative, but I guess that's a gray area. I guess it's up to you to decide whether that's extortion or not. But that is an argument that's been made that kind of advertising is extortion. But let's look at another. Let's say that this is a physical model. Let's say you've got some physical stores. They're all in a plaza. A, B, C, and D, they operate in a neighborhood. Okay, and they all get robbed regularly. Let's say people come in at gunpoint or whatever and rob the cash register. It happens all the time. And then there's one day a friendly mob that moves into the neighborhood. And this is a very polite mob. They would never rob anybody themselves. They don't do that. They don't do anything illegal. They're a perfectly legitimate business, and they're very polite. But they sell protection. So they basically sell security guards that stand outside. So just thugs, let's say. They sell thugs that stand outside and protect your store from getting robbed. And A, B, and C all buy protection from the mob. So what happens to D? And then what are D's options? So think about this for a bit, because there are a lot of ways this plays out. Now, the obvious answer from the outset is that D is going to get robbed repeatedly, right? Because now they're the only place that doesn't have a guard. They're the only unprotected organization in town. And that's probably true in the short term, that D is going to get all of the criminal attention. But long term, what happens to criminality in that area? Well, we know it's all directed towards D, so it becomes easier to catch criminals because they're attacking a very limited number of places. And crime becomes less lucrative in this area. If A, B, and C can no longer be robbed because they have protection, then D is the only one that can be robbed, and there's not a lot of money to be had because D is only a quarter of the robbing potential, let's say, that was there before. So criminality might just die out because of the economics of not having as many places to rob. What else might happen over time? What else might happen in the long term? So let's say A, B, and C buy protection, D doesn't. D gets robbed in the short term, but then in the long term, criminality dies out. Who is the winner in this case? To some extent, it's D, right? Depending on how much they lost to robbery before it died off from the economics of robbery becoming unsustainable, it's possible that D ends up being the winner because they didn't have to pay the mob for protection. And once you start paying this mob for protection, it's difficult to stop. Even though maybe they're not explicitly violent, now you've kind of gotten used to it, and what are you going to do? Just tell them to go away? Maybe you signed a contract. Maybe they make you sign a contract for protection, and you can't cancel it for 5 years or something. Okay. In that case, D is obviously going to come out ahead because A, B, and C are paying extra money for protection that is no longer necessary. But typically, what's going to happen is that D is going to get robbed repeatedly, and they're going to go out of business. So somebody said D goes out of business because the crime gets so bad. Yeah, that's typically what's going to happen to them in the short term. But if they can survive that short-term hurdle, then it becomes a question of will they benefit or not. And this is essentially the problem that the entire internet faces today. So this is the internet protection racket as it stands right now. So as it stands right now, A, B, and C basically have protection. And there's a very small portion of the internet that's still D. So at one point, let's say in the early 2000s and before, the internet was mostly self-hosted. If you were a business that had a website, and even if you were an individual that had a website, you would often host your website yourself or your web service yourself. So I don't want to say that this applies just to websites. It applies to any digital service. So enterprises typically had their own server room. We look at John Carroll, for example. We still have our own server room where we host a lot of different content. this is becoming a thing of the past at almost every organization. Organizations are no longer hosting their own content. The expertise required to do so has become relatively expensive. The hardware is relatively expensive. And more importantly, this protection racket is becoming cheaper and cheaper to purchase. So the protection racket is basically infrastructure as a service itself, the hosting of your website on a third-party service so you don't have to worry about it. One of the biggest advantages to this is that platforms like Azure, Cloudflare, AWS, Akamai, these will provide protection for you against denial of service attacks. So we've seen how easy it is to implement a denial of service attack. You guys did it in the first Red Blue Challenge. And DDoS can completely overwhelm your service and render it impossible for you to conduct business. Whereas if you join one of these hosting platforms, they have a tremendous amount of bandwidth available to them. So when a DDoS attack happens on your service, they simply allocate you more bandwidth to overcome it. And because these platforms are so giant, they can basically allocate a near infinite amount of bandwidth, so they basically can't be shut down unless somebody has unbelievable resources to DDoS them. So the protection that they provide by being a part of their network instead of by hosting it yourself is real, and it's cheap because it doesn't happen anymore, because DDoS is no longer lucrative, because it's no longer really possible. There's only a small number of websites left on the internet that are self-hosted and are subjected to this kind of thing. So the people who used to conduct those kinds of attacks have moved on basically to greener pastures. In fact, it's more lucrative to try to execute other kinds of scams on existing cloud-hosted organizations than it is to try to DDoS and then extort money out of the few remaining self-hosted services. So broadly, this is a problem that's been dealt with. We saw a lot of DDoS has shut down very popular services like game services. Famously, Xbox getting shut down on Christmas Day a few years ago. It used to happen pretty regularly. It doesn't happen too much anymore. You don't usually hear about a website getting shut down by DDoS much anymore. Instead, you hear about a cloud provider like AWS having an outage, as they did a few days ago. I think they had their most recent one. So let's talk about how big these providers are at this point. Amazon AWS is massive. They now host about 40% of the internet by some estimates. And Shield, which is the anti-DDoS protection suite that AWS comes with, is free. It comes standard with all their hosting, and it's not that expensive to host things on AWS. I think you can host a website there, probably get away with $5 a month if you don't have a lot of bandwidth. You might even be able to get away with it for free for a while if you use the micro package. I think they still allow you to unblock stuff there. So Azure, which is Microsoft's offering, hosts something like 20%. Cloudflare hosts something like 10%. And then between the remaining ones, like Akamai, they host the remaining share for the most part. The self-hosted places on the internet are becoming extinct very quickly. There's ransomware, a big growing market we've talked about earlier. Ransomware is basically when a hacker gains access to your machine, encrypts all of your data, and offers you to decrypt it for a price. So we just learned about encryption. If they've got your decryption key, remember, there is pretty much nothing you can do. Generally, they've got a screen that pops up once you boot up your computer that says, after you've paid us your bitcoins, we're going to give you the key you entered here, and we're going to decrypt your stuff. And then barring a vulnerability in the malware that lets you decrypt it without actually going through the steps, which is pretty rare these days, the malware's gotten pretty sophisticated to the point where that's usually not the case. You can't get your data back unless you fork over the money. So you offer the user to restore it for cash. Now, we've talked about some of the elements here before, but I want to go over again that this is a reputation-based market. How do you know that the hackers are actually going to decrypt your data? This is what's caused the greatest rise in ransomware, is the ability to actually trust that hackers will decrypt your data. Without this trust brokering, it's likely that ransomware still wouldn't be very lucrative, because none of these organizations would be able to or willing to pay out a ransom if they didn't know that their stuff was going to be decrypted. But now many organizations are paying out hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars in ransoms because these hacker groups that implement ransomware are notoriously trustworthy, surprisingly. Generally speaking, once you pay the bounty, they will decrypt your data and leave politely as they agreed. So this is very impressive and very weird that these organizations that are essentially criminals peddle in an industry where they have to have a high degree of reliability and a high degree of trust. And so that's going to lead very soon to a sort of meta industry in the ransomware world where people try to pretend to be other hacking groups in order to exploit a ransom and ruin each other's reputation, and hacking groups will wage war over their reputation if somebody else either questions it or besmirches it in some way. So we're going to get a very interesting scenario with different hacking groups trying to broker their reputation with one another. You can, for example, if you're a new hacker of ransomware on the scene, if you a new ransomware on the scene, how do you establish that you're going to be good for it, that you're actually going to decrypt the data? Well, you have to probably get an existing ransomware to vouch for you. So we're back to a kind of certificate-based system where trusted authorities or large authorities vouch for smaller ones as they go. Of course, you're going to end up having review sites where people post things like 5 stars. Data decoded quickly, would be ransomed again. And then you got your regular stealing on the internet. You've got just trying to extract money from people's accounts. Stealing on the internet, very difficult, not lucrative, very rarely done. In fact, I've seen situations where people have mistakenly given hackers access to their checking accounts, giving them their username and their password, and the hacker has full access to their bank account, and they still didn't do anything because, first of all, it's very easy to get caught. There's really no, again, place that you can move legitimate money from a checking account with it being untraceable unless you have a lot of sophistication and a lot of infrastructure, and most hackers do not. Or they're in nations where they know they could still be caught and extradited, or at least prosecuted in their country. So even when they have full access to checking accounts, they often don't use it anyway because it's just too difficult to get the money. In fact, valid stolen credit card numbers trade for pennies on the dollar on the black market because it's so difficult to use a stolen credit card. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to buy a Netflix subscription? It's going to get canceled as soon as the card's reported as stolen. Are you going to buy physical goods? You're going to get caught as soon as they ship to your address. So there's almost nothing that you can do with stolen real money, stolen real financial instruments like credit cards and checking accounts and things like that. Unless you have a lot of infrastructure to launder the money, or you live in a place where you're going to be able to steal it without fear of retribution from your local government or fear of extradition. So basically, real money stealing, almost non-existent. Still secure your bank accounts and all that stuff, but this is probably the least concerning thing for most people as they browse the internet. All you have to do not to be a victim of digital theft is to take your credit card and either put it in a safe place or just cut it in half and throw it in the trash. Well, after cutting it substantially so it can't be used, don't just cut it in half. But yeah, either cut it in half and throw it in the trash, or better yet, put it in a safe and don't touch it. Keep the pin somewhere separate or in your mind, and just don't use it ever, because the only way you can really be cleaned out in terms of your financial accounts is if somebody steals your debit card and pin and uses it. Which is probably the most common kind of bulk stealing, of digital stealing on the internet, is somebody either skimming your debit card or somehow otherwise getting access to it. Skimming is when they put some sort of scanner on the outside of a legitimate scanner, so there'll be a scanner on top of the real scanner at your ATM or something like that, and they'll skim your credit card off it. But if you use a credit card, you are never on the hook for the charges. Credit cards have zero liability to the consumer. So sign the back with check ID, check your monthly statement. Typically, when thieves do decide to use your credit card, they will first attempt to make small transactions as precursors to larger ones. So they'll try to see if they can charge a few dollars, and if they can't, then if they can, then they'll make a bigger charge. So if you didn't notice, me personally, my card's been stolen like over 5 times, and I don't care. The net loss to me is $0. I just report it stolen and get a new one. It's not a big deal. So I use my card everywhere. And some people argue, well, just use cash instead, it's more secure. First of all, it's generally more expensive. Second of all, if somebody steals your cash, you're out your cash, you have no recourse. So don't use your bank account on public devices, obviously. Use your bank account only on your most private device. And don't use cash because it is the most dangerous financial instrument. It can be stolen physically, and then of course you have no recourse because how are you going to get your physical cash back? How do you even prove that it's yours if you did? And if you're outside the USA, most of the rest of the world, they don't like credit cards very much, so places like the EU, they require a PIN instead of a signature, which is much better than our system, so hopefully we move to that one day. In most of Asia, they have secure apps like Venmo, so basically they use an app like WhatsApp to pay for everything. That's WeChat Pay, is their popular one. Places like Japan, they have pre-charged cards, so somebody was laughing about the $500 Google Play gift card. In Japan, that's basically how everybody pays for everything. They pre-charge a gift card, so to speak, that they can use pretty much anywhere. And these are semi-anonymous because you don't have to tie an account to them. You can use them without tying your name to them since they're basically prepaid. This is a good thing because your transactions are a little more anonymous, but also a bad thing because, like cash, you could lose them and you have usually no recourse. And then the EU also prefers e-checks when they're paying each other. So if you were to give, if you needed to give your friend $100 in America, you'd probably give them cash, or you might Venmo them or something of that nature. In many parts of the EU, they would issue an e-check, and that check would clear almost instantly in like the 3-day turnaround that we have in the United States, and they would have the money directly into their account instead of in some weird app where they may or may not have to pay a fee to use it. So hopefully we get some kind of system like that one day as well. Alright, lastly we've got your identity theft. The most common identity theft scam in the United States is probably by far the income tax scam, so watch out for that this year as tax season is coming up. That is when somebody files your income tax return for you and claims it. It's very difficult to get recourse for it once it happens to you. This happens over 5 million times a year, 30 billion plus in damages. It's very easy to do. You don't need a lot of information because the IRS is so not good at what they do. Basically, all you need is somebody's social. And then typically they use some kind of mule in the U.S. to collect the money. So to avoid being a victim of IRS tax return fraud, file your taxes early. Typically in January is good. The fraudsters will try to file before you. So if you file in April, you give them more opportunity to file before you. Obviously try to keep your social private, but of course everybody asks for it, so that's practically impossible. So the best solution is to file early, file electronically, and then the people who are trying to steal your tax return don't have the opportunity to do so because you've already claimed it legitimately. Okay, that's it for making money on the internet. Next time we're going to go back to looking at the application layer. Again, if you get that message from Amazon Workspaces, go ahead and set it up. That's it for today, guys. See you on Wednesday.